The guards raised the alarm at night when the watchman noticed a faint light under the door of the royal chambers. The officer on duty ordered everyone to be quiet, approached the door himself, and saw a shadow at the threshold. The door opened slightly, and a figure in a travelling cloak, familiar from the stable yard, slipped out through the crack. The cloak was tied with a belt, and a sword hilt without a scabbard hung from the belt. The guard recognized the young knight from the personal guard. The knight looked back and pulled up his hood. At that moment, the prince appeared in the corridor. He had returned from the council chamber, gloves in hand, and stopped to look at the face of the departing figure. The knight met his gaze and froze. The officer knew he should raise the alarm, but the prince raised his hand and gestured for silence. The knight walked across the carpet without clicking his heels and disappeared around the corner. The prince entered the chambers without asking permission. The maid at the window stepped back. The queen rose from a low stool, covered her shoulders with a shawl, and stared at her son. He went to the table, found a jug, poured himself some water, put the cup back in its place, and looked at his mother for a long time. He said nothing that night, only closed the door behind him, and in the morning sent a letter to the head of the secret chancellery with a short note and the heir's seal. From that moment on, life at court took on a different order. The knight's name was Matvei, although at court he was more often called by the nickname he had earned for his bearing and dexterity. He had been appointed to the guard 2 years ago after a tournament in the capital. He was from a land where people were accustomed to working in the cold and not arguing with orders. He was noticed for 3 reasons. He was an accurate shot, he remained calm around important people, and he did not try to say too much. The queen saw him in the courtyard in the spring when he was training the pages. She stopped on the balcony, but did not give a sign. Later, he was posted to guard the door to her chambers. Since then, the maids knew his footsteps, knew how he took off his gloves, how he looked at the floor when addressing the chambermaid. No one dared to speculate, but whispers spread quickly, as always in cramped rooms. The queen had lived for a long time under the weight of her husband's and advisors' decisions. She pretended that nothing affected her patients. Her habits were simple and regular. Prayer in the morning, then papers about monasteries and hospitals, lessons with young ladies in the afternoon, and dinner with her entourage in the evening. Her husband was rarely around. He did not ask questions about her affairs, preferring hunting and meetings. Her loneliness was filled with duties, and only late in the evening did she have time for her own thoughts. Once she called Matvei to move a chest. He came in, lifted the chest into place, stood still, and waited for a new order. She saw how his fingers held the lid, how he did not look directly at her, how he did not move unnecessarily. She asked him to come at night, to read the chronicles aloud, as she had a headache, and the maids' voices annoyed her. Matvei read quietly and did not mix up the words. This went on for a long time. Then she began to ask him to stay longer, to pour water, to bring a blanket, to tidy up the papers. Thus began a relationship that she justified by saying that her life was empty and dull, and that she felt calmer with this man around. The prince grew up under constant supervision. His tutors were strict, but they always gave in when he referred to the need to attend his father's meetings. He watched his parents' every gesture, their orders, their letters, the courtiers' glances, full of unspoken words. He had long noticed Matvei, appreciating his discipline and ability to keep his mouth shut. He saw how his mother became calmer in the months when the night was transferred closer to her door. He did not draw any conclusions until that night. After what he saw, he made a decision that seemed to him to be the only right one for his future reign. He believed that the kingdom was held together by order and fear, and that weakness at the top led to chaos. He came to his mother the next morning and did not utter a word of accusation. He simply handed her a bundle with 2 letters. The first was his oath to keep the secret. The second was a list of instructions that looked like requests for advice, but were actually orders. That same day, he wrote to the Chancellor that from now on he would review royal decrees before they were signed. Formally, it looked like a son's concern. In fact, he had opened the way to power for himself. The Queen read the letters and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She knew that her son understood everything. She understood that he would not go to his father because the throne was more important to him than propriety. She accepted the terms. She returned to the table where the grain stock reports lay and made the marks her son was waiting for. In the evening, she ordered her chambermaid to change the guard. Matvey came, as usual, without unnecessary movements. He noticed the icy composure in her gaze and the slight tremor in her hands. He understood that their secret no longer belonged to the 2 of them. He said nothing, but became more attentive to details. Now he chose the time of his entrance, watched the staircase, and disappeared before the officer changed. This maintained the appearance of order. The years passed monotonously, but inside the palace, everything had changed. The prince began to make decisions through his mother. He appointed officials, promoted and dismissed people, and disposed of lands, formally relying on the Queen's signature. She did not argue because she felt a constant threat. She still met with Matvey, but now she perceived each step as a risk for him and for herself. Her inner world shrank to a few rooms, a few faces, and a few objects. The key to the door, where her son's letters were kept. The ribbons that tied her diary. The ring she sometimes wore and sometimes took off. And the oak cross in the chapel. She stopped laughing in front of the ladies and stopped lingering at the windows. She aged in the eyes of the courtiers in a single season. Matvey continued his service. He was sent on raids to the border, put in charge of small detachments, and tested for his loyalty to orders. He returned without awards, but with marks in the lists. He was patiently promoted to standard-bearer, then given the insignia of an officer. The prince kept him close, as if not noticing the previous nights. In fact, the prince considered him a tool that was temporarily useful. He had a goal: to gather the treasury, negotiations with neighbors, and command of the guard in his hands. Matvey was not an enemy to him as long as he fulfilled the common task, not to rock the throne. The prince's private notes stated, "The knight is needed, while his mother still supports him." When the war with the southern neighbor began, Matvey was sent on a campaign. Although the king was aging, he loved to talk about laurels and the movement of banners. The council supported his decision. The prince did not object because he understood that war would strengthen his role. The queen tried to delay the departure of the guard, but her signature was almost meaningless. Matvey came to her on the last evening before his departure. He stood by the far wardrobe. She sat at the table. She pushed a leather talisman toward him, one that her father had once worn. He took it and hid it behind his breastplate. She looked at his hands and the oil stains from his weapons, imagined the dust of the road, and felt a void that could no longer be filled by her usual prayers. She walked him to the threshold and stopped. He bowed and left. The maid closed the door. The war was going badly. Letters came rarely and contained few details. One note mentioned a victory at the ford, another that the supply trains had fallen behind, and a third that the weather was bad and the horses were sick. 6 months later, news arrived in the capital of a clash on the plain, where the two armies had become mixed up, and the commanders could not see their own men in the meat grinder. Matvei's name was on the list of the dead. The messenger brought a belt with a buckle and a tiny leather pouch containing a talisman, returned without a word. The queen received the messenger, took the pouch, closed her eyes, and could not open them for a long time. She did not cry in front of people. She placed the pouch on the corner and covered it with a white cloth, as she did with letters she wanted to forget. In the evening, she went to the chapel and sat there until dawn. From that day on, she stopped attending balls, avoided music, and did not enter the hall where the portraits hung. She tried not to meet her son's gaze, but he came more and more often with new papers about land disputes and taxes. The prince took the news of the knight's death as a convenient outcome. He believed that now the risk of scandal was lower, and now he could press harder. He began to demand public support for his reforms from his mother. He ordered her to appear in the hall and sit on the throne next to her father when orders were announced that caused discontent among the nobility. He wanted her to bear some of the anger so that he could then accept her concessions with relief as a sign of wisdom. He saw that his mother was barely holding on, but considered it a temporary state. He was used to her boundless patience. He did not notice that the bottom was already close. The queen tried to live without night meetings and without secret breathing behind the door. She walked through the rooms mechanically. She opened and closed the wardrobe, rearranged the candles, stepped over the threshold, and returned, as if checking whether the floor was holding. She held the talisman that had been brought back from the field in her hands and felt the tiny scratches that made the cord uneven. She thought about her age, about how she looked in the mirror, how dry her hands had become, how straighter her back had become from the effort of holding herself up. She understood that her son had used her weakness to quickly gather power. She did not blame his mind, she blamed herself for giving him a reason. Her thoughts were confused and short. She avoided direct memories because they upset her balance. She stopped opening the window to the gallery because the noise from the courtyard annoyed her. She did not go out into the garden because she often met girls from the retinue there who were similar in age to herself in those years when everything seemed reversible. Once she asked her chambermaid to bring her a dagger that belonged to the prince from the armory. Formally, it was for a liturgical ritual of donation to a monastery. The dagger was thin, with a narrow blade and an engraved mark on the hilt. It had been given to the prince when he was knighted. The queen put it in a box and closed it. She kept the box on the table next to her papers for several days. Her gaze kept returning to it. She was afraid that the maids would understand something and was angry with herself. In the evening, she ordered no one to be let in and went to the chapel. The servants noticed that the queen was staying longer than usual. The chambermaid stood quietly at the door and listened. An hour passed, then another, and no one came out. Finally, the officer on duty called 2 guards. They stood there, exchanged glances, knocked, but there was no answer. Then the officer sent for the prince. The prince came quickly and opened the door with his key. Candles were burning at the altar in the chapel. The queen was hanging from a scarf, thrown over a hook for a lamp. Nearby, on the floor, lay a box with the lid open, and inside it was the prince's dagger. He approached, stopped, turned to the officer, and ordered the body to be removed. The servants rushed to the rope, cut the scarf, and lowered the queen to the floor. The chambermaid burst into tears, fell to her knees, and covered her face. The prince stood motionless, bent down, closed the box, picked it up, and gave it to the officer with orders to take it to the treasury. After that night, things changed in the palace. The servants whispered about the silk scarf, the box, and the dagger, but the rumors died at the door of the secret office. The next morning, the prince signed orders for a prayer service, a lavish funeral, and 3 days of mourning. He ordered the doctors to write a note about sudden heart failure. He forbade the courtiers from saying unnecessary words in the halls and corridors. He met with his father and informed him of his mother's death without giving any details. The king read the doctor's note and nodded vaguely without going into details. He did not know how to be close to people, and this time he did not learn how either. The funeral was without long speeches. People stood in rows, ladies held handkerchiefs, guards stood motionless. The prince led the procession, holding his head straight, placing a wreath on the coffin without pausing. The chambermaid kept her eyes on the floor. Several old courtiers looked at the prince and did not know what to feel. Everyone thought about their own thoughts. One recalled the night alarm, another, some mark on Matvei's hand, a third, the autumn ball, where the queen laughed differently than usual, as if allowing herself to be weaker. Some hoped that everything would calm down, and life would return to the usual exchange of notes and bows. The prince took over the queen's rooms and ordered everything unnecessary to be removed. He ordered the papers to be sorted, the notes to be burned, and the archives to be moved to the lower hall. He ordered the jewelers to recount the stones and the treasurer to close all private expenses of the court. He acted quickly, as if he wanted to erase the traces of previous years. He began to appear more often in the council chamber, speaking more evenly and more harshly. He stripped several counts of their privileges and transferred their lands to people who were indebted to him. He strengthened the palace security and replaced the guard officer he had seen that night. He sent new decrees on accounting procedures to the monasteries. He often lingered in the chapel, standing there as if checking to see if the lamps were burning properly. People took this as a sign of piety. He considered it a routine check. The chambermaid, who had served the queen for many years, began to walk quietly and unobtrusively. She kept a few things that they hadn't had time to take away: a ribbon with the scent of lavender, a pen with a dried ink stain on it, and a small piece of paper with numbers on it, which the queen used to check the amount of grain for the winter. The chambermaid took them to her room and hid them in a box from under a mirror. She did not know why she did this. She did not know how to think about politics, kings, and power. She simply wanted to preserve something real from what had been alive. She grieved silently and learned to walk around the palace so that no one would notice her. Rumors of the nighttime discovery in the chapel leaked out a month later. At the city gates, people were already discussing that the queen's heart had given out, that she had lived without love for years, that the rumors about the night were old fabrications. Some said that her son's dagger had been found in the box and that it was a sign that his mother was asking for his forgiveness. Others believed it was the opposite. The city went about its business, and within a week, the topic became just one of many. But in the palace, everything felt different. The Queen's empty room, where the furniture had been rearranged, remained her room, and those who entered it on business involuntarily lowered their voices. A tiny mark from a cup remained on the windowsill, which could not be wiped away, no matter how much they rubbed it. The prince worked late into the night. He corresponded with his southern neighbor, who agreed to peace in exchange for a ransom and border concessions. He dismissed several slow-moving treasurers. He checked the lists of the guard and crossed off those he suspected of excessive attachment to the old order. He often returned to the thought of that night when he held the box with the dagger in his hands. He understood that he had taken a path from which there was no turning back. He convinced himself that he had done the right thing. He called it necessary coldness. Sometimes, late at night, he would stop at the door of the chapel, listen to the silence behind it, and remember his mother's hand on the edge of the table and the quick glance she cast at the clock. He dismissed these memories as useless. A year passed. A new guardhouse was built in the capital, and reviews began to take place more often in the square. Refugees from the south came to the city and were housed in the old arsenal. The prince signed a decree for the construction of new granaries. His power seemed strong because he acted without hesitation. Inside, as he convinced himself, everything was calm. But on those days when the Queen used to go up to her chambers for evening prayers, he involuntarily counted his steps along the gallery, as if expecting the door to open and a silhouette in a familiar dress to appear. He understood that emptiness could not be filled with commands. The memory of Matvey remained in the ranks as a name on a list that only two people sighed over: the old standard-bearer from his company and the chambermaid who had seen him enter the chambers. The standard-bearer sometimes came to the palace gates, begging for alms for his sick wife, and the guard gave him small change because he recognized his familiar shoulders. The chambermaid sometimes took out the box from under the mirror and looked over the ribbon and the pen. She thought that people lived as if nothing was changing, but in reality, everything was quietly and imperceptibly falling apart. When the king died, the prince became king without dispute. He ordered the ceremony to be held quickly and without loud celebrations. He wanted the country to see him not as the heir to someone else's mistakes, but as its own strength. He ordered the rules of the court to be rewritten, reduced the number of audiences, and closed access to some halls. He continued to make sure that the light in the chapel was always on. He no longer carried the dagger from that box, although he did not admit to himself why. He put it at the bottom of a distant chest and did not open it unless necessary. Time smoothed out the rough edges. But every year, on the night when the guards raised the alarm in those distant times, the king would wake up and stare at the ceiling for a long time. He remembered the gloves in his hand, the narrow crack in the door, the footsteps on the carpet, and Matvey's empty face. He remembered his mother sinking to the floor in the chapel and how he had closed the box. He didn't know what he would have done differently, even if he could have returned to that corridor and that look. He chose a path where there were no excuses. He lived with it as a fact that was not to be discussed. His advisors saw in him willpower. His enemies saw calculation. His subjects saw order. No one knew that inside him there was always a place where neither advice nor guards nor prayer were allowed. Thus ended the story that began with silence at the door and a gesture demanding silence. The Queen, who tried to fill the void with nighttime meetings, could not withstand the pressure she herself had created and which her son had intensified for the sake of power. The knight, who promised no one unnecessary words, disappeared in a war in which he had no personal interest. The prince who became king got everything he wanted, but he couldn't get the box lying on the chapel floor out of his mind. The carpets in the palace corridors were replaced, new maps were hung on the walls, but the people who knew those years continued to look at the marks on the stone and shake their heads for a long time. They understood that greatness rarely exists separately from small personal decisions made at night when no one was supposed to see. And all that remained of that story was an order paid for with silence and empty rooms that no one entered without inattention.